So welcome to another satsang. There are a couple of points in the teaching that I wanted to reiterate and go over. Maybe explain what the concept in the teaching means, because within the framework, often a concept that is part of that framework is repeated, and the assumption is that it is understood. So one of those concepts that I'd like to focus on is happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. Another one is, what are we really looking for? And the third one, if we get to it, is I am, and I don't need to become. I am. I already am. So the main one is going to be this an explanation of the concept that your happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. And this is important because even though it is explained, there are certain characteristics of how various components of our life experience arise that can still make it very hard to see what is being pointed at. What does my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life really mean? And that's linked in with what am I really looking for? So first I'll emphasize why it is pointed out. Oh, there's another one. The fourth one is let's keep things practical. Why is that important? Why is that concept important? So we'll talk about that. They're all interconnected with each other. The question, which is often the beginning of the talk, is we need to ask ourselves, and this is linked to let's keep it practical. Practically speaking, what are we really looking for? What do I really want in life? And the reason that question is asked is because we have assumed that we know what we want in life, and that has become set in place as part of our deeply ingrained assumption. And our deeply ingrained assumption has assumed that maybe I want to be happy is what is put in place, and that happiness will come in the form of outcomes. So by asking us to ask that question, for the framework asking us, what is it that you really want? It's a very important question for you to ask yourself, is essentially suggesting that because inevitably we've got a wrong answer to that question. And the wrong answer to that question is part of what prevents us from actually finding the state that really satisfies, which is really what we really want, whether we realize it or not. And the truth is, we don't really realize it because we have this other idea of what we want. So an example of, or what this means is, we may have said, I want to be happy, unconsciously, not consciously, and we've looked out in the world and we have then said, and this will make me happy, based on a conclusion of looking at maybe someone else and saying, oh, I'd like to be like them. If I'm like them, then everything will be okay. If I'm like them, then I will be happy. And without us even realizing it, we have really said, what I really want is to be like them. Or we've said, I want to be happy and I'll get that by being like them. Maybe being like them in terms of their way of behaving in life, their personality, their successes. And so this question of ask yourself, what are you really looking for in life? And the suggested answer is, because we might have this idea that, let's say, I want to be famous. Could be an idea of what we think we really want. And once again, if that's in place, it's because we assume I want to be famous because if I was famous, then I would be happy, or then life would be okay. And so the question is saying, hang on, don't jump to these conclusions yet. Let's ask ourselves what we really want, and the suggested answer is you want the happiness that really is available to the human being, a happiness that most people don't have, because we could say it's elusive, simply because the way we have developed has created this path that we're forced down as an automatic movement that is never going to take us to the happiness that is available. So the suggestion is ask ourselves what we really want. And the suggestion is what you really want is true human happiness. And don't jump to the conclusion about where you will get it, which is what we have essentially been designed and programmed and shaped to do. So if we come up with the conclusion, I want true human happiness, then leave it at that. Because then if we keep that as the beacon for our search, the guiding light, we keep coming back, is this giving me what I truly want? We're less likely to make the mistake of going down the wrong rabbit hole. Now, if we use the word happiness and don't explain it, it's going to cause a problem, because the assumption is that the way that the word happiness, has this unconscious assumption about what it is and what will deliver it. So automatically, if we talk about happiness, unless it's really made clear, anyone hearing the word happiness is going to say, oh, that will come from circumstance. That will come when I am like that person that I admire, or that person who I think is so great, the person who seems to get everything right, or when I have more free time, or more finances, or more people that like me or love me, or a soulmate, whatever we think will deliver happiness to us. That's the deep ingrained assumption, and it is one of the big. It's the biggest mistake. The mistake that we don't even know is there, that says my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So we need to define what happiness is. Happiness in this teaching is not happiness through outcomes. Outcomes equal pleasure or pain. Now, that's not to say that pleasure or pain is irrelevant, that it doesn't matter whether we have pleasure or pain. It's not saying they're the same. Pleasure is more pleasurable than pain by its nature. And there is a benefit in pleasure over pain. It's not that they are the same. But when it comes to happiness, pleasure is not the determinant of our happiness. It can't be the determinant of our happiness. Pleasure, outcomes that are pleasurable, outcomes that are in line with our preferences, are pleasurable. That's what they are the determinant of. So outcomes are the determinant of whether we feel pleasure or pain. Now, pleasure or pain is on the biological level. It fits into the category of our biology, or biological reaction. So we have a structure, and part of our structure is biological, and part of our structure is psychological. So the human being is made up of, we could say, two levels: the biological level and the psychological level. And the psychological level has created a concept. The psychological part of the human being is essentially all conceptually based, and it says my happiness, my fulfillment, my well-being is based on the biological outcomes, the circumstance. And because the psychological has essentially identified with the biological level, it has created a merging of the two levels of the human being, such that they become seen as one unit, or not seen, they are felt as one unit and not seen as two layers of the human being. And so one of the big movements in the spiritual journey is for the psychological movements and the biological movements to start to be seen as distinct from each other, which is not possible when the psychological is insisting and desiring on circumstance being pleasure, 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 which is the normal sort of shape that the psychology takes. And so one of the ways that the layers start to separate out so that we can see the biological level and the psychological level is if we start to appreciate my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. So the deeply ingrained assumption that gets put in place as part of the standard human development is the assumption my happiness is to be found in outcomes. Right? That is the identification of who I am and circumstance, which really basically says I am not complete as I am, and I will be complete when things are perfect on a biological or a circumstantial level, which is a pretty fragile sense of self, because it's unrealistic for us to think things will be perfect on a biological or circumstantial level, given there are so many factors out of our control, and given the basis of life on a biological and circumstantial level being change. So even if things did become, perfect for a moment or a period of time, at some point that's going to change. And if perfection is achieved, change of perfection means essentially a move from perfection to non-perfection. So this idea that my happiness is to be found in circumstances is the psychological error. And it isn't the true self, which is good news. It just so happens that the true self is something that is in and of itself already complete, regardless of circumstance. So once we have become clear on this and asked ourselves, what am I really looking for? And if we keep it practical, which means not getting lost in an idea, because it's very easy if we don't keep it practical, where we come up with an answer to a question based on what psychologically sounds reasonable or sounds good, sounds attractive. So by keeping it practical, we tend to interfere with conceptual ideals that could easily become the answer to the question, what am I really looking for? We might have enough experience in life, if awareness is landed on, we say, who am I kidding? I just want something really simple. I just want to feel comfortable in life, as in feel comfortable with myself. feel comfortable throughout the day. And why would we one day say, if I'm keeping it practical, if I'm not going off into some idea about, oh, I'd like to invent something, or I'd like to be famous, which is really a psychological idea. It's what the psychological self would like. It's what the psychological self finds appealing and attractive. And if we keep it practical, we'll start seeing that the problem is really the actual uncomfortableness that we feel throughout the day, or from time to time in the day when certain things turn out a certain way, or when we just find ourselves engaging in life and not feeling satisfied, content, not feeling comfortable in our own existence. And that's when we can say, who am I kidding? I just want something really simple. Let me drop all these ideas about fame and fortune and love, and say, I just want the end of uncomfortableness with myself. And we might realize that we haven't answered the question like that. What we have said is, oh, I know what I want. And inevitably there's a whole lot of outcomes that we think, like, are deeply convinced will satisfy. And so it says, come back to basics. Who am I kidding? I just want to be happy is the word. And we say, I don't know where happiness is going to come from. Let me not make the assumption of knowing where it will come from. Let me just say, I just want to be happy. And then the teaching says, let's be very clear on what happiness is and what sort of happiness is available on a continuous, unbroken basis. And happiness that is available is happiness through peace of mind, not happiness through outcomes. Peace of mind is really just the absence of non-peace of mind. Non-peace of mind is suffering. It's that uncomfortableness. It's that resistance to life. It's that resentment. It's looking at the past with regret and looking into the future with expectation. Now, we've all experienced the happiness that is available. Maybe not on a continuous, unbroken basis, but there are moments in our life where the absence of suffering has existed. Now, it might happen accidentally in a way when we get distracted in a certain way by life, usually maybe involved in an activity that takes all of our attention and interferes with the normal narrative that is running. And then there is peace of mind in those moments. But that peace of mind is really quite ordinary. So this profound happiness or profound peace of mind that is spoken about turns out to be, it is profound, but it's ordinary. So when we hear about a profound happiness, we can easily assume it is not going to be subtle or ordinary. And so once again, we might create this idea of what profound happiness is, where we expect it to blow us away. And so that can also be part of what prevents us from really understanding the notion, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. Because in order for that to set in deeply, we need to start seeing the happiness that is not outcome-based. And that can be hard. It can be hard to do because I'll explain why. When in those moments, the moments that I've suggested we've all had from time to time, we feel that peace of mind, we are usually, or there usually is, a circumstance, or there always is a circumstance happening simultaneous to that. So you might be in the garden doing some gardening, and the suffering might fall away, and you might not even notice that suffering has fallen away. It just has fallen away. And there's something very ordinary, the absence of suffering, that we might not register as being there. We might not register that suffering has fallen away. And if we do register that, that's, I spent an hour doing gardening, and we'd say, what a relief compared to when I'm always worrying, let's say, about or rushing. And then we might say, that's because I was doing the gardening. It's because I wasn't doing my normal, work, let's say, or looking after the kids. And so the peace of mind that is available, which is the end of suffering, happened, but because it happened simultaneous to a circumstance, because it's bound to happen while we're in the waking state, and the waking state is also always accompanied by circumstance. And so when the very ordinary yet profound happiness that is available for the human being, which turns out to be just the absence of suffering, when that happens from time to time, it also happens simultaneous to circumstance. And it's so easy for us to assume it was because of that circumstance. So what this is suggesting is that, well, the absence of suffering, so we wouldn't say that on the outset, we wouldn't say, that would be available if I was sick in hospital, for example. We would say, well, no, if I was sick in hospital, I wouldn't be happy because it's not a good thing. So we might assume that peace of mind happened because I was doing something relaxing, let's say doing the gardening, or where an activity where you didn't have to think so much. Maybe you were just pulling weeds out of the lawn or something like that. And it wasn't because you were doing that. That might have been an activity that allowed the thinking to stop. It might have helped the thinking to stop. But the peace of mind was the fact that a certain type of thinking stopped. That was the peace of mind, that a certain type of thinking stopped. And the fact is that once that sets in and becomes a normality, what you'll find is that your happiness is not there because of the gardening. Your happiness is because a certain type of thinking has stopped. And you'll find that you could be happy in that way, even if you were in hospital feeling sick. Because the happiness that is being pointed at is not a circumstantial happiness. It's not a happiness because you were doing the gardening. The gardening might have helped the thinking, the thinking mind subside. But the actual happiness was the fact that the thinking mind subsided. So if you did find yourself in hospital free of the thinking mind, what you would find is, I'm in hospital, which is not ideal, and I have peace of mind. Now, that's unlikely to happen if we haven't noted that there is a happiness available, and that happiness is not circumstantial, but actually this change in our thinking mind, a falling away, a subsiding of the thinking mind. Why is it unlikely to happen in something like being in hospital? It's unlikely to happen because if we haven't seen that, we will continue to think that my happiness is to be found in circumstance. And when we find ourselves in hospital, which is not an ideal or pleasurable circumstance, not what we would think is a place where a circumstance that can foster human happiness, we will automatically be what we could call involved in circumstance, and that involvement in circumstance will prevent us from feeling peace of mind. It will actually create a sort of force us to feel suffering because we are in hospital. Meaning, if we continue to not see that our happiness is not to be found in circumstance, when we find ourselves in a circumstance that is not ideal, we will be forced to suffer because we will be involved in circumstance, saying this circumstance is not supportive of my wholeness. So that's why this pointer is so important. It's there to try and help us to separate this psychological involvement in circumstance. Psychological involvement in circumstance basically means that because of a deeply ingrained false sense of self, which really means a deeply ingrained belief, this enmeshment in circumstance happens, and that prevents a connection to our true self. And that means it prevents the peace of mind or the innate happiness that all humans have as their birthright from functioning, from flowing. So to follow on with this notion that on the human level there are two layers or two different levels, the biological and the psychological. The thinking mind is the thinking mind is essentially the psychological level. We could leave it at that and just sort of say thinking is the psychological level, and then circumstance. So let's say a fruit falls out of a tree because it's ripe and lands on your head. That is circumstance, and the actual fruit hitting your head is going to create biological pain that has nothing to do with thinking. It is just a circumstantial biological event that creates pain as part of the biological system. So the nerves get pressured by the fruit, and it will create biological pain. Now, what automatically and very quickly will probably happen is that biological pain will inspire a thinking process, or will inspire the arising of thought. And we could say that thinking is the psychological, which is our attitude to circumstance, our attitude about what has happened. Now, that wouldn't be entirely true, because there is a layer of thinking that we can also call biological. And that layer of thinking that we can call biological is what we could call functional thinking. So if a thought came up, what was that created that burst of pain? So that thought is a thought about the circumstance, but it doesn't fit into the category of the thinking mind or psychological thinking, and I'll explain why. So we might look around on the floor and see, oh, there's I don't know, an apple on the floor. Oh, the apple must have fallen out of the tree and hit me on the head. So that sort of thinking is simply functional thinking, looking at the circumstance and discerning what's what. And that thinking, in and of itself, or biological thinking, doesn't create suffering. It isn't suffering. It isn't psychological, and so it doesn't create an uncomfortableness on the level of self. It's pleasurable or painful. So biological thinking can be pleasurable or painful, or in fact neutral. So neutral would be that point in between the pleasure and pain spectrum. It's still on the pleasure and pain spectrum. It's just where it is neither pleasurable or painful as a thought. It's just, oh, that is red. Red might not be your a color you like, and so you might look at a wall and go, oh, and not like the wall, which is, you could say, pain. It's a biological response to the circumstance. Now, there is a response that usually comes with pain, that is the psychological response, because we tend not to be able to accept life as including pain. And the reason we can't accept life as including pain is because the psychological entity says my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So it essentially can't exist in a world that is inevitably pleasure and pain. It can't exist comfortably. So it assumes, it hopes that life circumstance can actually be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So that's one of the places where the psychological self starts to get lost in a conceptual rather than having a practical appreciation of life. It hopes that life can be pleasure, 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 and so it just doesn't want to accept the pain side of life. And a lot of wisdom teachings will point out that on one level of the life experience, life is a duality, both of interconnected opposites, good and bad, big and small, hot and cold, pleasure and pain. So the yin-yang symbol, black and white, and the two halves, the black and the white, make up the whole, symbolizing that the whole, which when seen from a bigger picture point of view, is not really two, but one whole. But that one whole is the duality, is the combination of black and white. And so on one level, we need to appreciate that the whole of life is a combination of pleasure and pain, good and bad. Now, our psychology doesn't want to accept that because it feels like its completeness is only going to be found in life that is pleasure, 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 pleasure. And so it just simply can't reconcile. It can't bring itself to admit that life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, or life includes both pleasure and pain. In the same way that the psychological self that assumes that happiness or contentment, really the absence of its uncomfortableness with itself, the psychological self that assumes that the end of uncomfortableness will come with perfection can't accept or admit the biological shortcomings or any shortcomings that we tend to have. It wants to deny shortcomings because it's seen as a self-sabotaging of its happiness to admit shortcomings. So this is the dynamic of the psychological self. And the psychological self manifests or presents as the thinking mind, both on the active level, where we can see the thinking, and the thinking mind or the psychological self has deep roots on the unconscious level. And when the psychological self on the unconscious level is functioning, there's just a feeling of things not being right, a dis-ease, uncomfortableness. And we might not even know what it is. It doesn't present as a set of thoughts or a movement of thought. Whereas if we were to dive into that uncomfortableness, what eventually would present is that uncomfortableness is coming from a narrative of thought on an unconscious level that we can't see. And deep down, the thought, which is based on a belief or an idea, the false sense of self, is I am not worthy, I am not good enough. It is shame, essentially. I am guilty. So deep down in the unconscious, the belief is I am not worthy, I am not good enough. That deep belief is essentially stems from the notion that has been put in place that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and the inevitable fact that a human being on a biological level is not perfect and therefore isn't going to get things, isn't going to function in a way that is going to deliver pleasure. And so each time there is a functioning of the person in such a way that doesn't deliver pleasure, psychologically we will say, you see, I haven't performed well enough because I didn't deliver an outcome of pleasure. And because the assumption is my happiness is to be found in pleasure, that creates a psychological idea of not being good enough. As in, I have failed myself by not delivering perfection. And I'm describing that as if it is, in relation to our own events, and there are some events that will have happened in our life that we will claim responsibility for, and essentially see ourselves as having failed, and therefore put in place this idea, I am not good enough. And then there will be just the way people treat us or say things about us, and that will confirm or add this another layer that says, I must not be good enough because of the fact I wasn't asked to join, or the fact that this person doesn't like me, or the fact that this person gets angry with me, whatever. And there's also a layer that is probably much more cumulative and historic, and maybe even outside the realm of our own life experience, and something that is part of the overall human condition, passed down through generations, and essentially part of our makeup when we're born. There is this seed of unworthiness that is passed on from this error that was made in previous generations. So I think the notion of original sin means this original mistake. Sin has its roots in the Latin language and means error. So the original error is the original error of thinking I am not good enough. And that is linked to my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And as we start seeing that our unhappiness is this involvement in outcomes, this judgment of ourself when things aren't perfect, the judgment of the other when the other does things that delivers pain to us. When we start seeing that that is my uncomfortableness, and then maybe start getting glimpses of times when we don't feel uncomfortable and realize it's just because there is the absence of the thinking mind, which in practical terms is guilt and blame, thinking I am the doer and the other is the doer, and that I haven't delivered pleasure in terms of these outcomes, they weren't the best outcomes, and the other hasn't delivered pleasure. So guilt and blame. Pride is the same principle of doership, but in relation to outcomes that do deliver pleasure, and we claim ownership over those. Really, ownership or doership is not how things happen. Things happen based on mechanics, and yet we don't. The psychological self doesn't see that I am and everyone else is a product of their genes and their up-to-date conditioning, factors that we're not in control of, factors that we didn't put in place. So really, our successes, our skills, our talents are not ours to claim ownership of. They might be there. We may be good at some things and not so good at other things. But they're a simple consequence of the luck of the draw, let's say. Evolution, they are a consequence of the process of evolution, if we want to look at it from a Darwinian genetic point of view, circumstance and genetics. So evolution essentially says, an animal in a circumstance that requires a long claw to get at insects, over time will develop that long claw. So its genetics will change and will be influenced by its circumstance. And so in the end, that animal is a result of its genes and up-to-date conditioning. Or you can sort of look at it from a non-evolution point of view and just say, I am in this way, I am this way in this moment, and I don't know how I became like this. We may not subscribe to a gradual process of evolution. We might just say, maybe God created me this way and created the universe this way, and it isn't a universe of impersonal evolution. And if God created us, then I can't claim ownership because God made me like this and made the other like that, and God dished out the talents and God dished out the lack of talent. So this doership is a psychological projection based on a misinterpretation of how things happen. A misinterpretation because it feels so much like I am a separate entity, uninfluenced by things, uncontrolled by things. That's how it feels. When we look at it, we see that I'm completely controlled by my brain, and my brain can stop functioning well. And if it stops functioning well because there's a blood clot or something like that, that's not something I'm in control of. And so the fact that it's functioning well basically means that all the pathways are not being obscured by some factor I'm not in control of, like a blood clot. And that essentially, when we look at it, means I'm not in control ever whether things are working well or not working well. It's just how it happens to be, and it's impersonal. And if we just go based on how things feel and not give much thought to the mechanics, then we'll say, well, I am the one thinking. I am the one doing these actions, and so the outcome, I am going to claim ownership. And so this I, this me, is the psychological idea of a doer that is being projected onto the mechanics, the biological mechanics. So the biological mechanics are something that just are here. And the psychological self is this claiming to be the one in control of the mechanics. And it's a fictitious idea of a self that can fall away. And if that self falls away, what will happen is the biological mechanics will still be here and they will continue to function. But they won't be seen to be my doing. So in Advaita, one of the realizations that's described, a realization of the sage, is that the body is functioning and I am not the body. And so what that is pointing at is a realization that there is a body, but the awareness that is aware of the body and its functioning is not the mechanics of the body. The mechanics of the body are happening, and then there is an awareness that is aware of what is happening. And that awareness is not the psychological self. So it's not the biological, it's not the psychological. It is a silent awareness that we could say is the core of the human being. It is the aspect of the human being that is already complete, is already happy, independent of circumstance. And that awareness, that essence, tends to reveal itself when the psychological involvement in circumstance, where the identification with form gets weaker. So where the identification with form falls away, the awareness that is neither the biological nor the psychological tends to become aware of itself. And in becoming aware of itself, and that's the third layer of the human being, it becomes apparent, and is not becomes apparent as some thought, it is felt. When awareness becomes aware of itself, that the sense of existence is grounded on the level of the awareness layer of the human being. And so happiness through peace of mind is the nature of the awareness aspect of the human being. So your happiness is not to be found in circumstance, means your happiness is not part of the biological aspect of the human being. It is not part of the psychological aspect of the human being. Your suffering is very much part of the psychological aspect of the human being. So the thinking mind, which is linked to the psychological or the expression of the psychological aspect, is what covers up our true happiness. And that's why true happiness is described as the absence of the psychological mind, or the absence of the me. And the me is always attitudinal to circumstance. It is in resistance to what is happening as part of the whole of life. It is blaming. It is judging. And it is attached to life being different because it is convinced that happiness is to be found in circumstance being pleasure, 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 pleasure. So these shifts, these changes happen as these layers are first pointed out. So we hear a conceptual description of it, and that conceptual description might then lead to a observation of our own life experience. Not necessarily in this moment, but tomorrow, or at any point when you're doing the shopping, there might be an awareness of an involvement in circumstance, an attachment to circumstance being a certain way, a doership attitude. So the two attitudes that make up or are the root of the psychological self and all of the psychological suffering is the attitude of attachment to outcome, which stems from my happiness is to be found on the biological level, on the circumstantial level, which is an error, and yet it's in place, and the attitude of personal doership, which says that's my happiness is to be found in circumstance, and I am the doer and the other is the doer. And therefore, I have to make it happen. I have to hate myself if I don't make it happen. I have to hate the other if they don't make it happen, or they interfere with life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. So this notion in the teaching that says your happiness is not to be found in circumstance means if someone does something that delivers pain, we automatically, if our structure is a certain way, will become involved in what the other has done to deliver pain and think that that is an attack on who I am, on who I know myself as, think it is an attack on my happiness. If what I've been speaking about starts to set in, the concept might come up and say, actually, the human being has these three layers, the biological, the psychological, and the self, or the awareness. And on the level of my essence, which is on the level of the self, if there is a groundedness on that level, then I will know myself as already happy regardless of circumstance, which means the other can steal something from you. And it is going to mean that you don't have that item anymore, which could mean that your life is less convenient, less pleasurable. So there can be pain because you have lost something material. And something on the material level can lead to biological pain, or the addition of something on the material level can lead to biological pleasure, which is nice or painful, but it is not a determinant factor of your happiness, which is the essence, the nature of the self part. So it requires awareness to start landing on these subtleties. And as this becomes clearer and clearer, we will see more often how our suffering that is involved in circumstance can start to get cut off. And in those moments, if we've been primed, we might then feel the peace of mind that happens when the suffering gets cut off. And we might realize that that peace of mind is not because circumstance is good. That's where we might realize, no, someone has stolen my bike, which means circumstance hasn't changed. You haven't suddenly got your bike back. And we might say, and yet I find myself at peace. And we'll only find ourselves at peace if the narrative that has gone into being involved in the fact that this is what is happening circumstantially, if that narrative gets cut off, because we remind ourselves, and that maybe leads to a connection or a groundedness onto the out of the layer of circumstance into the layer of self. And we feel in that moment, there is the peace of mind, because the suffering, the attitude of attachment to outcomes, the attitude of personal doership gets cut off. And that's where we might realize for ourselves that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And that's where we might get the answer for ourselves, that what I'm really looking for is happiness. And what happiness is, that is available on a continuous and unbroken basis, is not happiness through someone never stealing my bike or someone always delivering pleasure to me, but rather happiness through the end of suffering. And suffering is not biological, the end of biological pain. It is the end of our psychological involvement in the biological pain, the end of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes. So in summary, the four concepts that I said I would speak about. What are we really looking for is a question we need to ask ourselves. And we need to keep it practical. So those are two concepts I said we'd talk about. Why I need to keep it practical is because if we don't say, let me keep it practical, we very easily go off into the world of concept. And the world of concept can't see these subtleties. We can't see these subtleties. We need to see these subtleties by observing our experience, both on the circumstantial and, most importantly, on the inner layer of thought and feelings. Examine the circumstance, and that's where these nuances start to become apparent. So let's keep it practical basically means let me drop my ideas and let me start being guided by, we can say, I'm going to take the teaching ideas, the teaching concepts, as truth for a while, because this is if we trust them, if we think that they are, let's say, less filled with misunderstanding than we are. And one of the things that we need to realize is that if suffering is happening, it's because there is a confusion. It's because there is a set of misinterpretations of life, misinterpretations of self. So it's actually very empowering for us to say, I don't really know. I don't really understand. If I really understood, there wouldn't be a misunderstanding of self and there wouldn't be suffering, because if there is an understanding of self, the self doesn't feel uncomfortable. So if we feel uncomfortable in life, through a process of deductive reasoning, if we understand the dynamics, we'll say, I obviously don't understand. Now, this isn't self-deprecation. It's not putting ourselves down. It's about seeing the things as they are currently. So then we can say, well, a teaching is giving me the concepts that are more accurate, like my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. The concept we tend to have as part of our natural developments, which means a concept that has been forced on us, is my happiness is to be found in circumstance. So then the teaching comes in and says, well, what's more true is your happiness is not to be found in circumstance. So we can take a teaching, if we find a trust and a faith in it, and say, I'm going to run with what it says. Hopefully we don't turn it into a belief. If we turn it into a belief, what happens is we don't investigate it for ourselves based on our own experience. We don't use it as a pointer to point to our own experience. We just believe it blindly, which means we take it on as a concept, which means we don't keep it practical. We don't look on the level of our own experience. So the healthy position is to say, I'm going to trust the teaching, but I'm going to investigate those concepts that I trust and see it for myself. So we have to keep listening to the concept and saying, I trust it is giving me an accurate description. Now I need to see that by following the description. I need to see it for myself. And that is what is meant by the dissolution of misunderstanding. And the psychological self is essentially a construct of self based on misunderstanding. So when the misunderstanding collapses, usually gradually, layer by layer by layer, the psychological self gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and the self on the awareness, or the third aspect of the human being I spoke about, not biological, not psychological, but the silent awareness that in itself has the feeling of existence. I am. That's where our sense I am here, and I am, even the sense I am the body is there because of that third layer of awareness that in itself includes the very essence of existence. And we assume, because those three layers coexist, and because the body level and the thought level are much grosser than the awareness level, we assume that the sense of existence belongs to the body. The biological doesn't include the sense of existence in it. The sense of existence, which is the real self, is on this awareness, a more subtle aspect. And so it's the dissolving of the psychological self that allows a groundedness in that, on that level. What I mean by a groundedness is coming to know ourselves directly, to feel ourselves experientially, directly, not as a concept, not saying, oh, I exist, I am complete, because we can say those things as just a concept because we've heard them. We can repeat them maybe as like an affirmation, but not really know it from our own confirmation. As the psychological self dissolves, we will find ourselves resting in being. Being is the nature of the true essence or the true self. It's that sense of existence. And when we rest in being, the psychological self is not present. The uncomfortableness is not present. And that's when we realize, oh, I don't need to go anywhere. I don't need to get anything. I don't need to become something. I don't need my life to change circumstantially for me to be, and therefore to be happy. Remembering, by that stage we'll be saying, oh, happiness is not pleasure. Happiness is the profound yet ordinary peace of mind that really is just the absence of suffering. And suffering is guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. All of which, when we look at them, guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, are all based on the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. An attitude that is not our doing. So even the psychological self is not something that you or I are in control of, not something that you or I have succeeded or failed at. So enlightenment, which is the dissolution of the psychological self, is not something that anyone achieves. It's something that happens. And in the same vein, the unenlightenment, meaning the existence of the psychological self, is not something that anyone has done. It is also something that happens as part of the standard evolution of the human being. And enlightenment is an extension of that standard evolution. We essentially have to evolve into a creature that makes this error of self, becomes attached to outcome, suffers, and then as a result of that suffering being there for long enough, and when teachings come in and they resonate with us and they are received by us, the combination of the teachings and our attention onto our own experience progresses the evolution from an evolution into a world of suffering and out of that world of suffering, which really is the another way of saying it is that the psychological self develops at a very young age, 2 years old, and the tantrums start happening, and the me and the mine, and that's, you can't have that toy, that's mine, that's my pleasure, that's where my sense of self is invested. And that continues maybe up to the age of, death, or up to a certain point, and then a further evolution starts to dissolve that sense of self, eventually, potentially, leading to the end of suffering, which is not continuous bliss. It is not a oneness experience. Those things can be part of the process that lead to a much more ordinary happiness, which is simply the end of the suffering that you can know for yourself once awareness starts landing on it. And when it stops, you go, oh, that has stopped. That which I used to know, which used to arise, is now arising less for shorter duration. And at some point, if it starts arising less and for shorter duration, why would we think that it can't stop altogether? The fact that it is arising less and for shorter duration means that the concentration is getting weaker. Now, if a concentration of something gets weaker, it means it is being dissolved. Now, it can be healthy for us to say, so some teachings will say, suffering is never going to end. You just have to understand that that is the human condition, and that understanding that it's the human condition will mean that there can be a detachment from it, an acceptance of it. And if you look at it, why the teachings say that is because that is going to create a break from our insistence on something. So we could easily create a psychological insistence on the end of suffering. We hear about it and we think that's great. And then we say, oh, I want that, which is then creating an idea of life, meaning life free of suffering, that in principle might be the same as the idea of life that is pleasure, 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 meaning it is an idea of how I want the life that really I'm not in control of to be. And so hopefully we don't turn the end of suffering into an expectation, remembering that the fifth form of suffering is expectation. So ironically, when we hear about the end of suffering, it's very possible for the psychological self to say, oh, I want that, I'm going to get that. And if I don't have that, meaning if suffering arises, I'm now going to have to resist that and be uncomfortable with that. So these things anyway will work themselves out once the framework sets in. If that dynamic starts to happen, it will be seen at some point. Oh, a new form of suffering is happening because attachment to outcome, attachment to enlightenment is happening. So I'll take some questions if anyone has some questions. I see Sylvie, Cecilia have their hand up. Hi, Sylvie. Oh, just one moment. I still can't hear you. Try now.
Okay. Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. I the opportunity to say Happy New Year, first of all, because I haven't seen you since last year. Yeah, talk to you at least, and I wanted to thank you because I must say that I have been aware for a long time that uh, happiness was not to be found in circumstances, but I think I needed your pointer to actually see by myself the suffering, and it became more and more visible and aware of the reason of the suffering. Like when you said, gardening, I know that for a few years ago, I was doing gardening and I was feeling so good and so on that I wanted just to say, oh, I would spend my life gardening. And then it happens that I stopped my work and I went to the garden, but it didn't happen. I wasn't happy. And actually, because it was expectation behind it. And since I'm listening to you, I've been more and more aware about what is going on. And to stop that, it's not as that I'm stopping it, but I'm just looking at it. And as I'm aware of it, and the reason of it is just goes away.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that it's permanent. It's still, I mean, and I must say the other thing is the surrender to life. That has been a big stuff for me, to surrender. And the surrender is more and more happening with the awareness of, what is behind the suffering. And it's actually getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So thank you very much.
That's great to hear.
That's what I want to say
That's
from experience. And it's not a belief, because I don't mind beliefs. I always want to see by myself. But it really helped to have this pointer. That's all. Thank you.
You're welcome. And as Ramesh would say, because
I don't have any question. It's just a big thank you to you.
Very good.
And I will continue to in that direction. I don't know where it's going to lead me, but I just I just let it go. And also the big difference that I have been able to see now between pain and suffering. It was not obvious at the beginning, with the pain and the suffering. And it's okay. Life is pain and suffering. And to tell you the truth, I was in the hospital yesterday, and I wasn't suffering. It was just life. That's it. That's it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you're not in hospital now.
No. No, but I mean, circumstances. Life is. Life is going to. It's going to deliver whatever it's going to deliver. And that I understand. Now I understand that it can be pain. But in the meantime, I see the difference between the pain and the suffering, which is just something that I'm creating in the duration, because I'm either going backward, forward, or whatever. And I can really see it now. And as soon as I'm aware of it, it stops, because it has no point of being there. So it's good. For me, it's good, at least.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. My pleasure. I'm glad that it's received. One of the things why it's so hard to, at first, see the difference between pain and suffering is because automatically when someone, let's say, doesn't do what they say they were going to do, and we realize that they haven't done what they said they were going to do, the attitude of attachment to outcome says, I'm so angry at them because of what they didn't do. And so the suffering is our attitude, but because our attitude is towards circumstance, it's very hard for us to see that it isn't because of the circumstance. because it's the circumstance that is triggering the attitude towards circumstance. And because the attitude towards circumstance is a commentary about the circumstance, it seems like the suffering, which is the attitude, the suffering is in the attitude. It seems like it is caused by the circumstance, as in the uncomfortableness isn't easily seen to be our narrative about the circumstance. It happens simultaneous to the circumstance, and so at first we think, I feel uncomfortable because of the circumstance. And so this in-between bit, the link between the circumstance and our experience, which is the attitude to the circumstance, just is invisible until it is described as being there. So when, like, even in me answering or making a comment on what you were saying, there is a pointing out to anyone who's listening. There is this notion that says there is circumstance, which is someone not doing what they said, which is pain. There will be biological consequence to them not doing what they said, pain. And then there is my attitude to the circumstance and the pain. So it is being pointed out that there is a factor that at first we don't know about. And so if it's pointed out, there's more chance that we will come to see it. And then once we get a glimpse of it, and then the next time we see it, and at some point we become so clear that the suffering is not circumstantial. The circumstance is at worst painful. And then it becomes so clear that the suffering is all attitudinal, and it's a thinking about the circumstance. And so what you've described is where clearly that has become seen, and previously it wasn't seen, because it starts off being invisible. And so I guess
the aha moment when you say it is just like, so it gives you so much freedom. I mean, so much space.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, listening to you is one thing, but going through it is another thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but it's very much different. It's like,
it is, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the trap is not to, I mean, I didn't get anymore in the trap of wanting to stop it. I just let it go and just let it see. I mean, being aware is sufficient. I don't have to do anything. That's what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
I just have to be there and see it, but not doing anything. Before that, I was stopping and analyzing based on what you were saying, or this is it.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's different. It's just okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's how it starts off. At first, we do need to analyze it, because that's the sinking in of the concept, and at some point, the concept becomes so clear that we don't need to reinforce that anymore. It's like when you know your name, you don't have to remind yourself that your name is Roger. My name is Roger. Someone calls, and I look around automatically. At the very young age, there is a reinforcing, my name is Roger, my name is Roger. Not like that, but in however it happens automatically. And so at first we need to keep, the thought keeps coming up, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. I'm not the doer, the other isn't the doer, which cuts off the suffering. Once the understanding has sunk in enough, then that thinking doesn't have to happen anymore. And the deeper understanding automatically just sees where the attitude of attachment, for example, is happening. And it just sees it, and it doesn't need to even say, oh, that is an attitude of attachment. If it sees it, just like we know what the color red is, and you don't have to say that is red and that is blue and that is yellow. It just knows, okay, that is attachment. And like you say, the very awareness of the fact that attachment is happening is diminishing the attachment. Not necessarily in that moment, but over time we see that it diminishes. The whole dynamic diminishes.
But it doesn't change my preference. It doesn't change my biological me. No, it doesn't make me more zen or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but it's just, no, it doesn't change my preference or the fact that, but it doesn't, I mean, it's no, it doesn't make me suffer about how I blame myself or blame others or whatever. It's just that, okay, this is the way I like that or I don't like that, and this is it. I have to accept it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it's the truth, but it seems that I have a body that it has its preference. I have and then I have a psychological me, and then I have another. I mean, it's kind of different layers, and sometimes it just moves through those, through those layers. But I don't know.
Yeah, some things aren't going to change, and so even the suffering is, even though the suffering can fall away, there's a point where, if we understand that even the suffering is essentially no one's doing, it's just part of the structure in that moment. So then, when suffering happens, you say, "Well, what to do? Like nothing to do. It's just happening." And so that is the attitude of non-doership towards both the biological response, which isn't going to change, and the attitude of non-doership towards the psychological, which might change, but in this moment it's there. So the attitude of non-doership says it's here and it's a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning, and I didn't put that in place. So nothing to do other than see it for what it is.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvie. That's good news. Hi, Cecilia.
Okay. Hi, Roger.
Hello.
It's lovely to see you again.
Nice
I'm
to be
going to
here.
try and articulate this the best way I can. We are, in where I live, we are being forced back into what could be construed as dangerous circumstances for everybody's health. And yesterday, I found myself reacting attitudinally to this, and then catching myself and saying, whoa, wait a minute. It's like I'm jumping to conclusions about what might or might not happen where I have absolutely no idea, right? So I caught myself doing that. And so hopefully some awareness is happening within me. I believe it is. But I wanted to ask you, how can this dissolution that you speak about, and I do understand it, how is this, being able to attain, or not attain, but to be able to have things fall away, to be able to, have better awareness? How can this be helped? Is it through, examining our own experience? Is it through the analysis of the concepts and the pointers and how they apply, moment by moment in our life? Is it because we have to do more meditation? How practically, how can the dissolution be helped along? I don't know if it's really difficult to articulate what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? If
I
it
think
is a form, a way of thinking, like how can this be, how can this be helped along?
well, I think when certain things, a combination of things happen, then change happens. And so I think the dissolution happens when intellectually, at first intellectually, the dynamics are understood intellectually. So that's what the concepts, the teaching framework is doing, is it's presenting a conceptual description. So if that conceptual description lands, then there is a chance for that then to lead to someone seeing those dynamics at play for themselves, right? So if intellectually, let's say the concept, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. If intellectually that hasn't landed, then we're not going to see when, for example, the attitude of my happiness is to be found in the flow of life kicks in. So first it needs to land intellectually. Once it's landed intellectually, then when we see it for ourselves, that means it's gone deeper than just intellectual. We've seen it in action. And then when we start to realize that that is a habit or a movement that is in place that leads to something that isn't beneficial or worthwhile, that is what then tends to create the motivation for it to be interfered with in a healthy way. Now, what will allow all of those things to happen in a particular individual is a mystery, because everyone is like a very complex, computer program, let's say. And none of us really know what the very specifics of our own or the other's computer program is. So how something is going to land intellectually, and then once it's landed intellectually, whether we're going to see it in action for ourselves, and then whether the interfering with that habit happens. How all of that happens is a mystery in a way, or rather, it's not so much a mystery. It's we don't know exactly what's needed. But the fact is that we don't need to know, because we're either going to be a way that intellectually it clicks and then experientially it is seen, or it's not. So I can appreciate the question, which says, how do we improve it or maximize its possibility? And there's a fine line between, are we saying how do we control life in asking that question? And so the best I can do is describe how change happens, but then also say, but ultimately we're not really in control of, how the pieces fall together, because they either will or they won't. So listening to satsang is essentially being exposed to the intellectual concepts, which basically means if we are exposed to the intellectual concepts as opposed to not exposed to them, then that by default means the chance of them intellectually falling into place is maximized, or at least increased, because it's going to be pretty fortunate for something to intellectually fall into place if we haven't been exposed to the what we could say the truth, which really just means a more accurate concept than the one we're carrying. But at some point, there weren't many teachings, and people, enlightened people got it without the teachings. Now, the reason that is because we can become aware of our own life experience and start forming our own conclusions. The teachings just make it so much easier in a way, because they say, here, look, this is what you should look at. Whereas prior to teachings being here, people had to rely on much more good fortune, I guess, much more of the preconditions being there for someone to think and progress along in their thinking and move beyond the mistakes that are in place without the aid of a teaching that guides us more, which is probably why we will see liberation become more and more commonplace as it sets in more and more places, and there's more and more capacity for people to access the teachings that are right for them. And going back several thousands of years, there were less teachings and less tailored presentations of the teachings for a broader range of people, and so it was less likely to happen. So yes, listening to the satsang is the first part. The next, which is in the teaching, says it's not just about hearing the concept, but it's about investigating what the concepts are pointing to in your own daily life experience. And daily life experience doesn't just mean your circumstance, it also means looking at your attitude to circumstance, your reaction. And then the next part is seeing certain, let's say, thoughts arising that might be thoughts that cut off certain behaviors or certain narratives that have been seen for yourself. So seen for yourself in your own life experience. And then we start seeing a thought that says, for example, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. Now, that's not a thought that I'm suggesting, oh, you have to say that. But you might find that it starts happening in response to you having seen that there is an attitude that is essentially getting involved when someone doesn't do what they say. And then the thought starts happening and says, no, your happiness actually isn't dependent on them doing what they said they were going to do. And that is the cutting off of the habit happening. And that I think is, but even listening to a satsang is not really something you do. It is something that happens, and we might feel, if the sense of doership is in place, we go, no, I decided to listen to today's talk. When we look at it, yes, a decision was made, that your computer was turned on and you sat in your chair. But maybe that wasn't made by a me, but rather was a consequence of your particular makeup, meaning what you felt like doing. And the feeling, like where we say, oh, I feel like listening to satsang. That feeling, where did it come from? It sort of comes from deep down in the layers of the place where we're not controlling things. So even the feeling to watch satsang, we might start to realize, oh, that happened. And so even the very first part, which is expose yourself. So there's, in teachings, be in the company of sages. The reason that they say be in the company of sages is because if you're in the company of sages, you're going to hear concepts and you're going to see the sage functioning a certain way that is going to inspire and point out things. So even the being in the company of sages, or listening to satsang, reading spiritual text, it's not your doing, it's a happening that happens or it doesn't happen. Look at your children or your neighbors, whatever, and they may not have any interest in this whatsoever because they're not moved to, not because they as the doers are not moved to, but because that resonance isn't happening. And in your case, you're not choosing it as the doer, but rather the feeling that says, oh, that's what I feel like doing is coming up. So it's all happening on its own.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly then too, that the interference is something that happens
Oh, yes.
on its own. So it's not something that can have any control over. That's something that will happen on its own by virtue of all of these things.
Yeah, once the intellectual understanding sinks in and then we see the attachment to outcome and we realize that is the uncomfortableness, then automatically the system may start throwing up a reminder, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. And so the doer attitude will say, oh, well, so you're saying I have to remind myself, right? That's what the doer will say. I have to say my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And the reality is, no, there isn't anyone that does that. There is a body-mind organism that gets reprogrammed, and that reprogrammed body-mind organism might start throwing up the thought, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. So we have to see thoughts as something that arise, just like emotions. They arise in a body-mind organism. Thoughts arise in a body-mind organism. In the top-down Advaita, they would say it comes out, a thought arises out of nothing. An emotion arises out of nothing, which really is pointing at there isn't a doer that does a thought. There isn't a doer that does an emotion. It comes out of nothing. And so another way of saying is be aware of a thought arising in a body-mind organism, which really means a thought arising in the mind as a mechanical consequence of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is, someone might say, oh, they're saying completely different things. One says a thought arises out of nothing, which is not, so nothing is not the brain, it's not genes and up-to-date conditioning, it's nothing. And the other says, watch a thought arising in a body-mind organism, which really means watch the thought as an output of a brain, which is a mechanism, like a biological robot. And they might seem like contradictory concepts, because one is saying it's coming from a brain and the other says it's coming from out of consciousness, out of nothing. What is important and what is common to both of those is there is no doer. It is just happening automatically. And that is the attitude of non-doership, that is just sees all of that thinking that I have always thought is the me is not anyone. It is just thought arising as part of either the spontaneous moment, meaning that which is arising out of nothing, or thought coming from a biological robot. And that is radically different to our ordinary understanding of thinking. The ordinary understanding of thinking is I, the doer, thought that of my own volition. And that creates all sorts of involvement and misunderstanding of self.
Yeah, so yesterday my initial sort of gut reaction, I guess the biological, the body-mind concept reaction, that putting people in danger unnecessarily is just stupid. So that initial reaction is something that then just, and I caught it. I guess it's just precisely, it's coming out of nothingness. It's coming out of this robot, this mechanism, correct? If I understand correctly then?
Yeah, and it's the same with the both a biological or a psychological thought is coming out of nothing or coming out of mechanism. There isn't a doer that does either the biological or the psychological. So even if there is suffering, which is the psychological thought, even that is not anyone's doing. It is just the functioning of the body-mind organism on the psychological level, which still no one put in place. It is still part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. Or the biological level. So in principle, they're the same. In principle, we don't need to get involved with either of them. And that's what you're describing. You saw the involvement happening. And for an instant, there wasn't a seeing of the involvement. There was just the involvement. And then there was a seeing of it. And the seeing of it either cuts it off or it will carry on, but there will be an uninvolvement in it. Ultimately, a seeing of it will eventually cut it off, but it starts off where it won't necessarily get cut off. It will sometimes carry on, but it will be seen as this impersonal old habit, let's say.
Okay. And the last thing I wanted to ask is, you mentioned in several times in your satsangs that you obviously have had your own journey. That's obvious, and along on your journey, you have been helped again by probably going through this whole process yourself. And you mentioned maybe books or people that helped you along. Would you be willing at some point to share some of those resources with us? Is that possible, or is that, because I'm just happy coming here and listening to you, because like I said, it's like it's one of the living embodiments of the teachings. It's like being in the presence, like you say, in the presence of the sages who are going to talk about what is important, the teachings that are more true than the false concepts that we carry. But like, if there's anything that you think is also very valuable,
well, I mean, it was much more detailed than I remember, I think, because there was a period where I just found myself listening and reading so many things, and very varied and whatever. But the main things that just stick in my mind are one of the first books I read that I think is really quite a good book. Maybe it stands out because it was one of the first books that I read, was a book called Stop Thinking and Start Living. And then from there, it very quickly turned into a much more esoteric, or it seemed like a much more esoteric non-duality set of content. Although Stop Thinking and Start Living, I haven't read it for more than 20 years, but maybe I'll find it's exactly non-duality in its own soft cover book. So that was the first book I think that I came across, and then the teachings of Ramana, the teachings of Nisargadatta, the teachings of A Course in Miracle, the teachings of Socrates, and then obviously some Eckhart Tolle and Ramesh, sort of rounding it all off. I think once I got to Ramesh, all those other things had come beforehand. All the other things, A Course in Miracles, the teachings of Nisargadatta, the teachings of Ramana, and the teachings of A Course in Miracles. Oh, I think I mentioned A Course in Miracles already. They're all very esoteric in a way, not really that practical. The world is not real, essentially. pointing at the self level, which is not on the biological, not the psychological, and just pointing at the only reality and truth is the self. And that created an awakening and an appreciation of that aspect. And that's what the top-down teachings do, is essentially they minimize the biological and the psychological as unreal, which, looking back on it, is a sort of an overstatement, but it's very necessary in order for awareness to land on the subtle layer. And I guess Ramesh, for me, was what was needed after those awakenings to say, well, the biological level does exist. Pleasure and pain is there, but it's not where your happiness is to be found. So I think from the top-down teachings, you land on the self, become aware of the self, and there is a sense of peace. But there also is, as part of that process, a sort of detachment and bypassing of the biological and everyday living. And that at some point needs to be corrected in a way, or refined. Not to say that that was a problem, because that's what allowed the appreciation of the subtle level to be seen. But it can leave some concepts in place, like, the world doesn't exist, or I am not the body, that if they were to perpetuate forever would mean an imbalance is remaining in place. And so for me, Ramesh was, I guess, what you would call embodiment or integration, which means after awakening there is a further integrating of the understanding into daily living, where there is an acceptance of the biological, and a merging, I guess, of the biological level and the awareness as two parts of the whole, or two sides of the coin. And what essentially gets eliminated is the psychological level.
Thank you again, and I hope when I retire in a couple of years that I will come to Australia and go and do one of your wonderful live-in, still holding them, live-in, what do you call them? Live-in...
the retreats.
Retreats, that's it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you again so much for doing this every weekend for us. Thank you.
You're welcome. I see Harleen's hand is up. So, hi Harleen.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for taking my question.
No problem.
So when faced with unworthiness in a situation, my natural tendency is to carry a lot of hard feelings for the other who's made me feel this way. And in spite of all these years of listening to the teachings, I just in the heat of the moment, I am not able to get into that place of that it's actually my attitude to that circumstance that's making me feel that way, and the other is not responsible for it.
Mm-hmm.
And also, in many satsangs, it's been mentioned that being dependent on the other for your happiness is a recipe of suffering, because that just can't happen. But then, are there no loved ones to be dependent on?
Not for your happiness. There are loved ones and friends and whatever that will deliver aspects of biological pleasure and depth in life. And so if someone lets you down, let's say, that will result in pain, and pain can include emotional pain. It can be sad if someone who you trust, for example, lets you down. You can find yourself being emotionally sad. Now, what that will often trigger psychological sadness, or not psychological sadness, but it will not only will there be biological and emotional sadness, it will then trigger psychological guilt, blame, and expectation. But if that doesn't kick up, if that were to dissolve, there will still be, when someone passes away, for example, the potential for biological pain or biological sadness. But that biological pain and sadness has a very different quality to it. So my answer is, are we not dependent on the other at all? And the thing is, no, not for your happiness, but biologically we are inevitably intertwined with all of life, which includes the other. Normally, the biological pain will lead to psychological suffering when the structure is the standard human conditioning. So what I would suggest is that in principle or intellectually, if you can work on this, the other has absolutely no capacity to create suffering in you. The other has, through their actions, the other's actions have the potential to deliver pleasure or pain to you. That is the worst that the other can do, is create pain for you. The suffering is always created on your side of the fence. Why that's not clear is because the suffering that is created on my side or on our side of the fence is, let's say, a blame of the other for the fact that they let you down, or the fact that they did or didn't do something. And so it seems like the suffering is not created on this side of the fence. It seems like it is created because they didn't do something. So if we can keep in mind that the other, at worst, can create pain, but suffering is always created on this side of the fence.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just that in the attitude, when the other in my side of the fence has the capacity to make me feel that way, sort of, there's a lot of feeling weak, feeling that just feels like too weak. Lack of better word.
But if you look at it, that weakness, what you mean by weak is probably more like a sense of inadequacy. Like, why can't I be better? Why can't I not be triggered by those actions and create suffering? And so in that there is the attitude of doership, right? So when I say that the suffering is created on our side of the fence, I could use the word, the suffering is our fault, right? Not their fault. But when I say it's our fault, I don't mean our fault as a doer. So I use the word fault just to illustrate a point here. It isn't really our fault at all. it is that our structure is a certain way. Our structure is a way that, and our structure is not something. Did you ever put your structure in place? Did you ever spend any time building a structure? It's something that sort of just happens as a result of, you could say, the genetics of your parents, which you had no control over, and then how your genetics responded to, how your parents treated you, which also wasn't in their control. It was just happening. And so all of those factors create you as you are. But you never did it. It happened to you. Or it happened to the body-mind organism. So when someone lets you down, that's because their body-mind organism is functioning a particular way. And that is pain on a circumstantial level. The suffering is either going to happen or not happen, and it's on your side of the fence. But the truth is, there isn't a doer on your side of the fence that is responsible for that. And when you feel like, if you feel weak, it's because there is, I would suggest, this attitude of doership. Because if that attitude's not there, you go, it's like, what to do? Means what to do is not really a question mark. It's more like, there's nothing to do. It's just, this is how it is. And ironically, someone might say, well, that's not very helpful, because that's not going to change anything. The truth is that I think it is that attitude of what to do that brings about the most change, because even the attitude of what to do is quite a profoundly wise attitude. It's really seeing that there is no doer. Because if we didn't see that there is no doer, meaning if we believe there is a doer, we don't say what to do. We say, I need to change this. I need to stop being weak. So the very attitude of what to do is already seeing that there is nothing to do, because there is no doer. It's just happening.
Yeah, so perhaps the feeling of weakness and the feeling of inadequacy would just dissolve in time, and then I might just know how to engage without the dependency being there.
Yeah, I mean, that will be that the dependency just won't be there as things dissolve. So if the feeling of weakness arises, hopefully it arises, and then a what to do kicks in, right? Even what to do about this feeling of weakness. That already means that change to the dynamic of weakness is happening. So, as you just described it, the process will happen on its own, and even this what to do is not something that you as a doer are doing, but rather when the understanding kicks in to a certain level, the what to do is automatic. The attitude of non-doership towards the feeling of weakness. So the feeling of weakness is an attitude of doership. And if there is the attitude of non-doership towards the attitude of doership, that is better than if there was the attitude of doership to the attitude of doership. And eventually we have the attitude of non-doership to we start off with the attitude of doership to the attitude of doership, which means I have to change this isn't good enough and all that. Then it changes to the attitude of non-doership to the attitude of doership. And then it eventually starts dissolving the attitude of doership at the core. The attitude of non-doership on the outside starts making its way into the core, and then we find even that feeling of weakness stops being there. And if that stops being there, then you'll find the dependency also will be next on the chopping block. So it's always the attitude of non-doership working its way into the center.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Harleen. Nice chatting. So there's one more hand up. I know we're over time, but I'll be quick with Barbie. Hi, Barbie. Or Betsy.
Hello, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I can hear you too. I'm from Holland. My English isn't so good, so I'm sorry for that. It's very good to speak you. A long story in short. I had in my life a lot of experience, mystical experience of oneness. And about 1.5 years ago, I was just sitting, and in one moment, I was thinking, I play all my life roles. And that was so clear for me that I have played a lot of roles. And suddenly it became quiet. I stopped thinking. I didn't feel my body. And I disappeared in the awareness. I think there was nothing, but in that feeling, it was very peaceful. It was very natural. It was like I belong there, and that is what I was. I don't know how long it takes. When I come back from it, and I feel very quiet and very peaceful, and the peace has never left me. It's still in me, and I think I have experienced what awareness is. That I am awareness, and there is no Betsy. Is that correct? What I say?
Yes, it sounds like that's a peak experience a peak experience that has then, I guess, become more subtle in a way, but the peace remains. And why I say a peak experience is because in the moment, you transcended the narrative of the thinking mind that had become so ingrained, where you saw that there was always sort of a mask and a presentation to the world of someone, Betsy would present themselves as, this is how I am. And in a way, there's an inauthenticity in us doing that, which is how we grow up presenting what we think the world wants to see of us, what we think will deliver outcomes, which is where we think our happiness will be. And it basically means we're not showing our true self, we're contriving something. So if we're sad, we might cover the sadness up, and we might laugh because people want to see that. And there's that can become tiring at some point. And you described it as, just a flash in a way, but there may have been a whole lot of considering these roles and feeling it that you want something more true. And then in that moment, there was a moving beyond, or you saw the narrative, you saw the thought, the thinking of what is presented to the world, or the thinking mind. And there is a seeing. It doesn't need to be there, or it all happens very quick. It's just it collapses essentially. And until that point, there is full involvement in that, and so it doesn't get seen as something that can collapse. It feels like this is who I am. So I think what you describe is the moving beyond the psychological self and the true self, the awareness that isn't dependent on and isn't thought, isn't the psychological self, isn't the biological, that presented itself, that became known to itself. So awakening is referred to as awareness becoming aware of itself, which really means awareness resting in itself, just being. And that being becomes self-evident as something not dependent on an image or a presentation to the world. It is, and it's the essence of the human being. And so a lot of people have those awakenings, feel the peace, and then gradually it fades away and the old structure comes back, and then there is a craving because they don't know what they did for it to fall away, and then they just feel it fading away. They don't know what they did for the psychological self to fall away, and it feels very freeing. And then that experience tends to fade away, and the old sense of self comes back in, and what comes back in is the contraction that comes with that psychological sense of self. And the contraction is let's say, the falling away of the spaciousness. And then people can get very frustrated and crave it and seek it. And because they didn't do it in the first place, if it's not their destiny and they're seeking, it may remain elusive for a long time. From what you've described, there was a resting in that being, meaning a transcending of the psychological self in that moment, and then it didn't fade away, which I guess means that your seeking up to that point in time was sufficient for the psychological self not to come back in, and for the awareness, the level of being to remain accessible and remain who you know yourself as.
Yes. There is no problem at that moment, but since the experience, I don't know what to do with my life here on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I got my gifts, but I feel I'm ready here on Earth, and I really don't know what to do.
Mm. Well, oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, that's the question. I don't know what to do.
Mm.
Yeah, of course, I have my friends and my family, and I like to be there for them. But all my life, I have searched. I want to reach something. The ego wants a lot that I can see now when I look back in my life. My ego always wants something, but my ego don't want something now. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not searching for anything.
Yes. So that what we can mistake is, for as long as the body continues to be alive, even with the falling away of the psychological self, life is about the body moving according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning, its preferences, let's say, and the circumstance that we find ourselves in. So even after liberation, we still find ourselves waking up each morning in circumstance. And so my answer is do whatever you feel like in each moment. That's the integration of the understanding into daily living, where we realize until the body dies, life carries on. And so there, even though there isn't a psychological craving, now there is a freedom to allow the body to move. So if the body wants to go for a walk, then allow that to happen. If you feel tired, you can have a sleep. If you are hungry, you have a meal, which is obviously still happening. So all I'm saying is that your awareness can land on the fact that life until the body dies will carry on. And even without a psychological craving for things, which we can be very thankful for, because that means a whole layer of suffering has fallen away, then you say, oh, I don't have to dictate what my life looks like. It's just in any moment, I will do what I feel like doing. And even what you feel like doing is more, it's a description of what is happening. And that might clear up what can be overlooking the fact, because we can have we might think, oh, I don't know what to do, but the fact is you don't need to know what to do. Life will keep happening. If you're tired, sleep. If you're hungry, eat. If you want to go for a walk, go for a walk. If you want to see your friends, see your friends.
That's the way I live now. I just see what pops up in the now, and I do it or I don't do it, and yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I think the searching for what to do now is also an ego thing.
Yes, that's why I think we need to see life will carry on, and there isn't a question of there is nothing to do. It's like life carries on, and at some point the body will die, and then that's the end. Or who knows what is after, but for this body-mind organism, that's the end.
Can you say the world how it is the way it is? It has to be the way it is. You can't.
Yeah, it's only ever turned out one way.
Well, but say it again, please, Roger.
Life has only ever turned out one way
Yes.
throughout history. If you look back 1,000,000 years, in each moment, it collapses or it manifests. It falls into place one way. World War I had a certain conclusion. World War II had a certain conclusion. Today, at 8 o'clock was one way, at 8:01 was one way, at 9 o'clock was one way, at 9:01 was one way. The whole of life always collapses into the present moment in one way. And that is the only way it could have collapsed. Life only turns out one way. And that way is what is happening. It's the only way. And our psychology creates a story of, oh, it could have been this way, it should have been this way. And if we look back on it, we say, it only ever turned out one way. And that then is our psychological reconciling with what is, essentially. Life only ever turns out one way.
I can do nothing to change life.
That's right.
Well, sometimes when I was thinking about consciousness and life, I still do, I become a little bit mad that people hurt people, that people hurt animals, and that makes me sad. But that's also what it is, and it's supposed to be the way it is, I think.
Well, yes, it is the way it is. I mean, even this notion of supposed to be, because we might, when we look at it's supposed to be, we might realize we have a bit of a story about what it is supposed to be. So it is only one way. So, like cruelty, we look at it and we say it's inevitable, it's undeniable. Humans are cruel. Unfortunate things happen. Even we can look at ourselves, and there's times when we will function in ways that, when we look back on it on the hindsight, we say that wasn't ideal. And so we can look at life and say, yes, that's how it is. And it's not surprising that because life is unkind, we can feel sad about that. Biologically, we can feel biologically sad. We're not going to be happy about the fact that someone is cruel to someone else. But we can be in acceptance of it. So acceptance of it doesn't mean that we will then not feel biological sadness. In the same way, if someone lets us down, we can feel biological sadness, but simultaneously understand that that is life, and be at peace even with the pain that someone we trust or care about has hurt us. And that's the difference between pain and suffering and pain and peace of mind. So your sadness is a form of emotional pain. Well, it may be psychological suffering, but I don't think we would be human, even liberated human, if we didn't have compassion for the suffering or the pain inflicted on others.
But can I say that awareness is creating all this?
At some point, we'll even stop saying that, because if you look at it in a way, that is a concept about where all of life comes from. That is a useful concept because it basically is making life, the good and the bad of life, impersonal. So it means that we stop feeling shame and we stop blaming the other. We've essentially said, oh, it's all God's will. So that is a concept that helps helps to make it less personal, means less blame of us and less blame of the other. And then at some point, even the concept of God can fall away, because we say, well, I don't know about, do you know about God? Or do you know about an awareness that creates all of this? We know that to be aware of what is happening, there has to be awareness. But do we know that awareness creates the circumstance? That is a spiritual teaching concept that is very useful. And at some point we might even say, well, it just is what it is. I don't know why it is. I don't know anything, but it is.
I can't see you anymore, and I didn't hear you for a few seconds. Can you hear me still?
I can hear you still, yes.
Yeah, I can see you. I understand what you are telling, but I think that can a human being not control his ego? When I can choose to hurt someone, but I also can choose not to hurt someone.
According to your design, you know, when we choose not to hurt someone, I would say it's really our design that is functioning in a way that doesn't hurt someone, and then we say, oh, I chose that. But if our design was different, you may not be able to choose it. You know, some people that hurt other people would say, I'd love to be able to not hurt people because it just causes problems. It doesn't make me feel good, but I can't seem to achieve it. And that's because their design doesn't allow them to achieve it.
I can't see you anymore, and didn't hear you for a few seconds. Can you hear me still?
Well, I think the internet's breaking up, so it might be a good time to bring the satsang to an end.
Yeah, I understand.
Thank you, Betsy. Nice talking to you. I'm glad that the piece is setting in, or has set in. Thank you, everybody.